Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the mist of time, back to the year 323 BCE, when the greatest conqueror the world had ever known lay dying in the palace of Babylon. Alexander the Great, who had conquered everything from Greece to India, who had crushed the mighty Persian Empire and spread Greek culture across 3 continents, was about to take his final breath. He was only 32 years old, and his empire stretched further than any before it. But as the young king's life slipped away, a question hung heavy in the air. Who would inherit this vast domain? Among the generals gathered around Alexander's deathbed was a man named Seleucus. He was not the most famous of Alexander's companions, not as well known as Ptolemy or Perdiccas, but he was capable, intelligent, and patient. Seleucus had fought beside Alexander through countless battles, had crossed deserts and mountains, had seen the edges of the known world. Now as his king lay dying, Seleucus watched and waited, knowing that everything was about to change. The story goes that when someone asked Alexander to whom he would leave his empire, he whispered the words, "To the strongest." Whether this actually happened or not, those words became prophecy. Within hours of Alexander's death, his generals began positioning themselves to seize pieces of his vast conquest. These men, known to history as the Diadochi, the successors, would spend the next 40 years fighting each other for control of Alexander's legacy. At first, Seleucus did not stand out among these ambitious generals. He was given command of the companion cavalry, an honor to be sure, but not a kingdom. Others moved faster. Ptolemy seized Egypt and would never let it go. Antigonus took control of much of Asia Minor. Lysimachus claimed Thrace. Cassander positioned himself to rule Macedonia itself. Seleucus, meanwhile, maneuvered carefully, biding his time. In 320 BCE, Seleucus was appointed satrap of Babylon, one of the richest provinces of the former Persian Empire. This ancient city, with its hanging gardens and its temples, its canals and its merchant quarters, became Seleucus's base of power. From Babylon, he could see the vast eastern territories that Alexander had conquered, but never fully consolidated. Persia, Bactria, Sogdiana, even distant India beckoned with possibilities. But holding Babylon would prove more difficult than claiming it. The wars of the successors intensified, and Seleucus found himself caught between competing powers. In 316 BCE, Antigonus, the one-eyed general who harbored dreams of reuniting Alexander's entire empire under his own rule, drove Seleucus out of Babylon. Seleucus fled to Egypt to the court of Ptolemy, and for 4 years he was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. These years of exile taught Seleucus patience and diplomacy. He did not waste his time in bitterness. Instead, he built alliances, learned the art of coalition building, and waited for his moment. That moment came in 312 BCE, a date so significant that it would later become the beginning of the Seleucid calendar, marking year 1 of a new era. With a small army provided by Ptolemy, Seleucus marched back to Babylon. In a brilliant campaign, he defeated Antigonus's forces and reclaimed his capital. The citizens of Babylon, tired of war and instability, welcomed him back. Seleucus stood once more in the great city where he had first tasted power, but now he understood that merely holding Babylon was not enough. If he wanted to survive in the brutal world of the successor kingdoms, he would need to build something greater, something lasting. From 312 BCE onward, Seleucus began his great expansion eastward. While other successors fought over Greece, Macedonia, and Asia Minor, Seleucus turned his gaze toward the rising sun, toward the vast territories that Alexander had conquered, but that now lay fragmented and leaderless. He marched his armies through Media and Persia, through Syria and Parthia. City by city, province by province, he brought the eastern satrapies back under his control. The eastern campaign was not a simple military conquest. Seleucus understood that these lands, with their ancient cultures and their proud peoples, could not be held by force alone. He adopted many Persian customs and titles. He married Apama, a Sogdian princess, and honored her as his queen, even when political convenience might have suggested otherwise. Their son, Antiochus, born of Greek and Persian blood, would symbolize the fusion of cultures that Seleucus envisioned for his empire. By 305 BCE, Seleucus had pushed as far as India, where he encountered a new power rising in the east, the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta. Rather than exhaust his forces in an endless war, Seleucus made a pragmatic decision. He negotiated a treaty with Chandragupta, trading territory for 500 war elephants. These elephants would prove invaluable in the wars to come, and the peace secured Seleucus's eastern frontier. When Seleucus returned from his eastern campaigns, he was no longer just a satrap or a regional strongman. He was the master of the largest territorial domain among all of Alexander's successors. His empire stretched from Syria to the borders of India, encompassing Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Iranian plateau. He controlled the ancient heartlands of the Persian Empire, the crossroads of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia and India. In 301 BCE, Seleucus joined with other successors to face their common enemy, Antigonus, who still dreamed of reuniting all of Alexander's conquests. At the Battle of Ipsus in Phrygia, Seleucus's war elephants turned the tide. Antigonus was killed, his forces scattered, and his territories divided among the victors. Seleucus claimed Syria and much of Asia Minor, bringing the Western Mediterranean into his sphere of influence. The Seleucid Empire was now a reality. It was not just a collection of conquered territories, but an emerging state with its own character, its own vision. Seleucus began to build. He founded cities throughout his realm, naming many after himself. Seleucia on the Tigris, which would rival Babylon as a metropolis. Seleucia Pieria near the Mediterranean. Dozens of other Seleucias scattered across his domains. He also honored his son, founding city after city named Antiochia, including the great Antioch in Syria that would become one of the most important cities of the ancient world. These new cities were not merely vanity projects. They were strategic foundations, Greek islands in a vast eastern sea, places where Greek and Macedonian settlers could maintain their culture while interacting with local populations. They became centers of trade, administration, and culture, spreading the Greek language and Greek ways, while simultaneously absorbing influences from the older civilizations around them. Seleucus ruled for nearly 30 years after reclaiming Babylon. In that time, he transformed himself from a displaced general into a legitimate monarch, the founder of a dynasty. He took the title of king in 305 BCE, along with the other successors, formally ending the pretense that Alexander's empire might somehow be restored. He was Seleucus Nicator, Seleucus the Victor, and his empire would bear his name for nearly 3 centuries. In 281 BCE, at the age of 78, Seleucus was assassinated by Ptolemy Ceraunus while preparing to reclaim his ancestral Macedonia. He had survived countless battles, had outlived most of his fellow generals, had built an empire that spanned 2 continents. But in the end, he fell to treachery, as so many great men of his age did. His body was brought back to Syria, where his son Antiochus gave him a royal funeral befitting the founder of a dynasty. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the torchlit procession through the streets of Seleucia, the mourners following the bier of the old general who had become a king. His work was done. The empire he built would now pass to his descendants, who would face their own challenges in the centuries to come. The foundation had been laid, the cities built, the territories claimed. Now the true test would begin. Could the Seleucid Empire endure? Let your breathing slow and steady as we move forward through time, into the reign of Antiochus the Great, the king who would bring the Seleucid Empire to the height of its power and glory. But first, we must pass through the reigns of the early kings, the consolidators and builders who transformed Seleucus's conquests into a functioning empire. Antiochus I, son of Seleucus and the Bactrian princess Apama, inherited a vast realm in 281 BCE. He had already been co-ruling with his father for years, governing the eastern provinces while Seleucus focused on the west. This made the transition of power smooth, unusual in an age where succession often meant civil war. Antiochus I, called Soter the Savior, faced the enormous challenge of holding together territories that spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, and had little in common except their Macedonian rulers. Antiochus has continued his father's policy of founding cities. He strengthened the system of satrapies, appointing capable governors to manage distant provinces. He fought wars on multiple fronts, defending his realm against the Galatians in Asia Minor, those Celtic warriors who had migrated into Anatolia and terrorized the Greek cities there. His victories against them earned him his epithet Soter, and secured his reputation as a defender of Greek civilization against barbarian incursions. Under Antiochus I and his successor, Antiochus II, the Seleucid Empire developed its characteristic institutions. The king ruled as an absolute monarch, but he relied on a sophisticated bureaucracy inherited from the Persians and adapted to Greek administrative practices. The empire was divided into satrapies, each governed by a strategos or satrap who collected taxes, maintained order, and raised troops when needed. The royal road, that ancient highway system built by the Persian kings, was maintained and expanded, allowing messages and armies to move swiftly across vast distances. The cities founded by the Seleucids became engines of cultural transformation. Antioch in Syria, built by Seleucus and expanded by his successors, grew into a magnificent metropolis. Its streets were laid out in the grid pattern, beloved by Greek city planners. Colonnaded avenues lined with shops and temples gave it a distinctly Greek character. But the population was mixed. Greeks and Macedonians certainly, but also Syrians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, and traders from across the known world. In the markets, you could hear a dozen languages, smell spices from India and incense from Arabia, see silk from China and ivory from Africa. Seleucia on the Tigris, built near ancient Babylon, became one of the largest cities in the world, home to hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. It was a Greek city in the heart of Mesopotamia, with temples to Greek gods standing alongside Babylonian ziggurats. Its citizens attended Greek theaters and gymnasiums, but they also participated in Babylonian religious festivals. This blending of cultures, this Hellenization of the East and Orientalization of the Greeks, was perhaps the Seleucids' most lasting achievement. The economy flourished under Seleucid rule. The empire sat astride crucial trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to India and Central Asia. Luxury goods flowed west, silk, spices, precious stones, exotic animals. Greek wine, olive oil, metalwork, and manufactured goods flowed east. The Seleucid kings grew wealthy from taxing this commerce, and they used that wealth to maintain their armies, build their cities, and patronize arts and sciences. But the empire also faced constant challenges. Its very size was a weakness as much as a strength. Communication across such distances was difficult. Local governors in distant provinces could easily become semi-independent if the central authority weakened. And there were always wars, against Ptolemaic Egypt for control of Syria and Palestine, against emerging kingdoms in Asia Minor, against rebels and separatists in the eastern provinces. The most serious loss came early. Bactria, that remote province in Central Asia, began to slip away from Seleucid control in the middle of the 3rd century BCE. Around 250 BCE, the Bactrian satrap Diodotus declared himself king, establishing an independent Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This distant realm, where Greek culture flourished in the shadow of the Hindu Kush mountains, would survive for another century, but it was lost to the Seleucids. Even more serious was the rise of the Parthians. Around the same time that Bactria broke away, a nomadic people called the Parni, led by a chieftain named Arsaces, conquered the satrapy of Parthia in northeastern Iran. The Seleucid kings tried to suppress this rebellion, but the Parthians were skilled horsemen and archers, masters of their harsh terrain. They would prove impossible to dislodge, and over time they would grow from a minor insurgency into an empire that would challenge Rome itself. Despite these losses in the Far East, the Seleucid Empire remained formidable. And then came Antiochus III, who would be known to history as Antiochus the Great. He ascended the throne in 223 BCE at the young age of 18. The empire he inherited was weakened by defeats and territorial losses. Many doubted that this young king could restore Seleucid power. They were wrong. Antiochus III proved to be a capable military commander and an ambitious ruler. In his early years, he fought wars against Ptolemaic Egypt for control of Syria, that strategic strip of territory that included Judea and Phoenicia. He suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, but he learned from this setback and returned to the offensive. Most remarkably, Antiochus III undertook an eastern campaign that consciously echoed Alexander the Great's conquests. Between 212 and 205 BCE, he marched an army deep into the eastern provinces, reasserting Seleucid authority where it had weakened or disappeared. He campaigned in Media and Persia, marched through Parthia and Bactria, even reached India, where he renewed treaties with the local powers. This great eastern expedition, which ancient historians called the Anabasis, in deliberate parallel to Alexander's conquests, restored Seleucid control over vast territories and earned Antiochus his epithet, the Great. When Antiochus returned from the east, he turned his attention back to the Mediterranean. In 200 BCE, he defeated the Ptolemaic forces at the Battle of Panium, finally securing permanent control of Syria for the Seleucid Empire. This victory brought wealthy territories and important port cities under his control. The Seleucid Empire seemed resurgent, powerful, ready to reclaim its position as the greatest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Antiochus III then made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He turned his attention to Greece and Asia Minor, territories that he claimed as his rightful inheritance from Seleucus I. He crossed into Europe, taking control of cities in Thrace. He meddled in Greek affairs, presenting himself as a liberator of the Greek cities from Macedonian domination. But in doing so, he drew the attention of a new power rising in the West, a power that would soon dominate the entire Mediterranean world, Rome. For now, though, as sleep pulls you deeper, imagine the Seleucid Empire at its height under Antiochus the Great. Picture the great cities with their temples and theaters, their markets bustling with traders from every corner of the known world. See the royal armies on parade, the Greek phalanxes with their long spears, the cavalry from Media and Persia, the war elephants from India, soldiers speaking a babel of languages united under the Seleucid standard. This was the golden age of the empire, the moment when everything seemed possible before the storm clouds gathering in the west would break over the ancient east. Allow yourself to sink deeper into rest as we follow the story of how the mighty Seleucid Empire first encountered the Roman Republic, a meeting that would forever change the destiny of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the early years of the 2nd century BCE, Rome was still largely unknown in the East. The Romans had conquered Italy and defeated Carthage in the First Punic War, but to the great Hellenistic kingdoms, they were merely another Western power, crude and barbaric compared to the sophisticated Greek culture that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus III did not fear Rome. He had defeated the Ptolemies, reasserted control over the eastern satrapies, and expanded his influence into Asia Minor and Thrace. When Roman ambassadors came to him demanding that he withdraw from Europe and cease interfering in Greek affairs, Antiochus was insulted. Who were these Romans to dictate terms to a king whose empire stretched from the Mediterranean to India? He had rebuilt what Seleucus had created, had earned his title as Antiochus the Great through years of warfare and statecraft. The Romans, however, had just finished defeating Philip V of Macedon in the Second Macedonian War. They had declared the Greek cities free from Macedonian domination and were in no mood to see another Eastern monarch filling the power vacuum. When Antiochus gave sanctuary to Hannibal, Rome's greatest enemy, who had fled to his court after Carthage's defeat, the Romans saw it as a deliberate provocation. In 192 BCE, war came. Antiochus crossed into Greece with an army, expecting the Greek cities to welcome him as a liberator from Roman influence. Some did, but not enough. The Romans responded swiftly, sending legions east under the command of capable generals. In 191 BCE, at the Battle of Thermopylae, the same pass where 300 Spartans had once faced the Persian Empire, Roman forces defeated Antiochus and drove him out of Greece. But the Romans did not stop there. They did what no Western power had done before. They crossed into Asia. In 190 BCE, at the Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor, Roman legions and their allies met the great army of Antiochus III. The Seleucid forces were impressive, over 70,000 men, including the famed phalanx, cavalry from across the empire, war elephants and scythed chariots. It was a host that would have awed any enemy. The Roman legions tore them apart. The flexible Roman manipular formation proved superior to the rigid phalanx. The elephants, when wounded, panicked and stampeded through their own lines. The scythed chariots were useless against disciplined infantry. By the end of the day, the Seleucid army was shattered, and Antiochus the Great was forced to flee. For the first time, a Roman army had defeated one of the great Hellenistic kingdoms in open battle on Asian soil. The Treaty of Apamea in 188 BCE was humiliating for the Seleucids. Antiochus III was forced to abandon all his territories in Asia Minor, north of the Taurus Mountains. He had to pay a massive indemnity of 15,000 talents, an enormous sum that would drain the royal treasury for years. He was forbidden from keeping war elephants or maintaining a fleet. His son Antiochus was sent to Rome as a hostage, to be held as a guarantee of Seleucid good behavior. Antiochus III died in 187 BCE while attempting to plunder a temple in Elam to raise money to pay the Roman indemnity. He was killed by angry locals, a pathetic end for a king who had once been called the Great. His son Seleucus IV inherited an empire diminished and humiliated. Struggling under the weight of the Roman debt, the loss of Asia Minor was a catastrophe for the Seleucid Empire. Those wealthy provinces had provided crucial revenue and served as a buffer against threats from the west. Now that buffer was gone, and the empire was poorer and more vulnerable. The psychological impact was perhaps even worse than the territorial and financial losses. The Seleucids had always seen themselves as the successors of Alexander, the champions of Greek civilization in the East. Now they had been defeated and humiliated by a Western power, forced to accept terms like a conquered enemy. Seleucus IV struggled to pay the Roman indemnity while maintaining control of his remaining territories. He was eventually assassinated by his own minister in 175 BCE, and the throne passed to his brother, who had been a hostage in Rome. This prince would rule as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and his reign would bring both glory and disaster to the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus IV was a complex figure, brilliant and erratic, ambitious and impulsive. Having lived in Rome during its rise to dominance, he understood Roman power better than most of his subjects. He was also deeply Hellenized, even by the standards of the Seleucid dynasty. He loved Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek religion. He patronized artists and intellectuals, founded cities and temples, and tried to present himself as the embodiment of Hellenistic kingship. Antiochus IV came to the throne determined to restore Seleucid prestige and power. He campaigned successfully in the east, reasserting royal authority in regions that had grown semi-independent. He then turned his attention to the old rivalry with Ptolemaic Egypt. In 170 BCE, he invaded Egypt and achieved remarkable success, conquering most of the kingdom and even having himself crowned as pharaoh in Memphis. But then Rome intervened. A Roman ambassador, Gaius Popilius Linus, met Antiochus IV outside Alexandria. The Roman handed the king a tablet containing a Senate decree demanding that Antiochus withdraw from Egypt immediately. When Antiochus asked for time to consult with his advisors, Popilius did something remarkable. He drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus with his walking stick and told the king he must answer before stepping out of the circle. Antiochus IV, the great king, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to Persia, stood inside that circle drawn in the sand and understood that he had no choice. He could either obey Rome or face war with the power that had crushed his father. He agreed to withdraw from Egypt. This incident, known as the Day of Eleusis, marked the moment when everyone understood that Rome was now the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, and that the independence of the Hellenistic kingdoms existed only at Roman sufferance. Humiliated by this encounter, Antiochus IV returned to his empire and sought victory elsewhere. He turned his attention to Judea, a province that had been growing increasingly difficult to govern. The Jewish population was divided between those who embraced Hellenization and those who clung to traditional ways. Antiochus IV, needing money and wanting to fully integrate Judea into his empire, decided to accelerate Hellenization and plunder the wealthy temple in Jerusalem. In 167 BCE, Antiochus IV desecrated the temple, dedicating it to Zeus and outlawing Jewish religious practices. This triggered the Maccabean Revolt, a religious and nationalist uprising that would haunt the Seleucids for decades. The Jews, led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, waged guerrilla warfare against Seleucid forces, inflicting surprising defeats on royal armies. As you drift in the borderlands of sleep, imagine the weight settling over the Seleucid Empire in these years. The glory days of Seleucus and the early kings were fading into memory. The Romans loomed in the west, arbiters of international affairs, limiting Seleucid freedom of action. In Judea, rebels fought in the hills, refusing to accept the authority of kings who had ruled the region for over a century. In the east, Parthia grew stronger, no longer just a rebellious satrapy, but an emerging empire in its own right. The Seleucid Empire was still vast, still powerful, but the cracks were beginning to show. Let your mind wander through the corridors of time as we enter the most troubled period of Seleucid history, an era of civil wars and territorial losses, of strong kings followed by weak ones, of brief resurgences crushed by longer periods of decline. The rot that would eventually destroy the empire was setting in, spreading through the body politic like a slow disease. Antiochus IV Epiphanes died in 164 BCE while campaigning in the east, leaving behind a young son, Antiochus V. The boy king reigned for only 2 years before being murdered by a rival claimant to the throne. And thus began the curse that would plague the Seleucids for the next century. Disputed successions, civil wars between rival claimants, and the constant intervention of foreign powers in Seleucid affairs. The Maccabean Revolt continued to drain Seleucid resources. The Jewish rebels proved impossible to suppress completely. Seleucid commanders won battles, but could not win the war. Eventually, exhausted by the conflict and needing to focus on other threats, the Seleucids granted the Jews religious freedom and increasing autonomy. By 142 BCE, Judea had effectively gained independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, and the Seleucids were too weak to reclaim it. The loss of Judea was part of a broader pattern of territorial disintegration. In the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire began to fragment like a pot developing cracks. Local governors and generals, seeing the weakness at the center, carved out their own domains. Demarchus, the satrap of Media, briefly established an independent kingdom before being suppressed. In Commagene, in northern Syria, the local dynasty asserted its independence. In Persis, the homeland of the Persian Empire, local rulers began to strike their own coins and act as independent monarchs, while nominally acknowledging Seleucid suzerainty. Most seriously, the Parthians continued their expansion. Under their king Mithridates III, who ruled from 171 to 138 BCE, Parthia transformed from a regional power into a true empire. Mithridates conquered Media, the heart of ancient Persia, taking the royal capital of Ecbatana in 148 BCE. He then pushed into Mesopotamia, conquering Babylon itself in 141 BCE, the ancient city where Seleucus had first established his power. The jewel of the East fell to the Parthians. The Seleucid response to these disasters was hampered by internal conflicts. Different branches of the royal family fought each other for the throne, each backed by different factions of the nobility and different foreign powers. Brothers fought brothers, uncles fought nephews, and the empire bled from these internal wounds even as external enemies devoured its territories. Demetrius II, who became king in 145 BCE, attempted to reverse Seleucid fortunes. He was young, energetic, and determined to restore the empire his ancestors had built. In 139 BCE, he led a large army east to reconquer the lost provinces from the Parthians. It was a disaster. The Parthian king Mithridates I defeated and captured Demetrius, holding him prisoner for 10 years. The king's brother Antiochus VII took the throne in his absence, Antiochus VII. Sidetes was the last strong Seleucid king, the final flicker of greatness before the long darkness. He fought successfully against internal rebels and external enemies. He reconquered Judea, besieging Jerusalem, and forcing the Hasmoneans to acknowledge Seleucid suzerainty once more. He brought order to Syria and restored royal authority over fractious nobles and generals. In 130 BCE, Antiochus VII launched his own campaign to recover the eastern provinces from Parthia. He achieved remarkable success, reconquering Mesopotamia and advancing deep into Parthian territory. For a moment, it seemed as though the Seleucid Empire might yet be restored to its former glory. But in 129 BCE, during winter quarters in Media, Antiochus VII was killed in battle against the Parthians. His army was destroyed, and with it died the last real hope of Seleucid recovery. The Parthians released Demetrius II, who returned to reclaim his throne. But the man who came back from captivity was not the energetic young king who had marched east a decade before. He was broken, listless, incapable of effective rule. The Seleucid Empire descended into chaos. Multiple claimants fought for the throne. The great cities were besieged and sacked by one faction or another. The countryside was ravaged by the passage of armies. Trade declined, revenues fell, and the machinery of imperial administration ground to a halt. In 126 BCE, Demetrius II was killed fighting yet another usurper. The throne passed to his son Seleucus IV, who reigned for less than a year before being murdered by his mother Cleopatra Thea. She placed her younger son, Antiochus VIII, on the throne and ruled through him. This period, when the Queen Mother held power, was marked by vicious court intrigue, poisonings, and assassinations. When Cleopatra Thea tried to poison Antiochus VIII, he forced her to drink the poison herself. The late 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE saw the Seleucid Empire reduced to little more than Syria and parts of Cilicia. Everything else was gone. Mesopotamia and Persia to the Parthians, Judea independent under the Hasmoneans, Asia Minor divided among various kingdoms and Roman client states. The cities that Seleucus and his successors had founded in the east now served new masters or governed themselves as independent city-states. Even the Syrian heartland was divided. Different members of the Seleucid family controlled different cities, fighting endless civil wars against each other. Antioch might acknowledge one king while Damascus supported another, and armies would march back and forth between them, destroying what little prosperity remained. The great Hellenistic cities, once showcases of Greek culture and prosperity, became battlegrounds. Into this chaos came new threats from without. The Armenian king Tigranes II, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness, conquered Syria in 83 BCE, briefly ending even the nominal independence of the Seleucid realm. For 14 years, Syria was an Armenian province, and it seemed as though the Seleucid dynasty had finally come to an end. But the dynasty was not quite finished. When the Roman general Lucullus defeated Tigranes and drove the Armenians out of Syria in 69 BCE, he restored a Seleucid prince to the throne. Antiochus the Great returned to rule what remained of his ancestors' empire, little more than the city of Antioch and its immediate surroundings, a kingdom that could be crossed in a day's ride, a pathetic remnant of an empire that had once stretched from the Mediterranean to India. As you sink deeper into slumber, imagine the sadness of those final years. The great cities crumbling, their populations diminished by war and economic decline. The palaces where mighty kings had once held court, now occupied by rival claimants, with only handfuls of soldiers to support their pretensions. The royal treasury empty, the army unpaid, the bureaucracy collapsed. The glory had faded, and only the memory remained of what the Seleucid Empire had once been. Rest now as we approach the final chapter of Seleucid independence, the last flickering of a flame that had burned for nearly 3 centuries. The Seleucid Empire in its last decades was barely worthy of the name empire. It was a small Syrian kingdom, one minor player in a region dominated by larger powers, its continued existence a matter of indifference to most of the world. Antiochus the Great, Asiaticus, ruled his tiny realm under the shadow of Rome. By the 1st century BCE, Roman power had spread throughout the Mediterranean. They had conquered Macedonia, defeated the Seleucids' old rivals, the Ptolemies in Egypt, reduced the kingdoms of Asia Minor to client states. The Romans no longer needed to draw circles in the sand. Their word was law from Spain to Syria, and their legions enforced that law wherever resistance arose. In Syria itself, the situation was chaotic. Multiple claimants to the Seleucid throne fought each other, each seeking support from Rome or from the other regional powers. Philip II controlled Damascus for a time. Antiochus the Great held Antioch. But their authority was weak, their territories tiny, their armies small and poorly trained. The great military machine that Seleucus had built, that Antiochus III had led to India and back, was reduced to bands of mercenaries fighting over scraps. The Syrian population had grown weary of the constant warfare between rival Seleucids. The cities wanted peace and prosperity, not endless sieges and changes of regime. Many began to look to Rome not as an enemy, but as a potential savior, a power that might bring stability to a region that had known only chaos for generations. In 64 BCE, the Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in the east at the head of a powerful army. Pompey had been given extraordinary powers by the Roman Senate to reorganize the eastern provinces and deal with the threat posed by Mithridates VI of Pontus. Having defeated Mithridates and settled affairs in Asia Minor and Armenia, Pompey turned his attention to Syria. Antiochus III came to Pompey seeking recognition and support. The young king hoped that Roman backing would help him secure his throne against his rivals and perhaps even expand his tiny realm. But Pompey had other ideas. After hearing Antiochus's petition, after consulting with his advisors and receiving embassies from Syrian cities begging for direct Roman rule, Pompey made his decision. He abolished the Seleucid kingdom. Just like that. With a decree, nearly 3 centuries of Seleucid rule came to an end. Syria became a Roman province, governed by a Roman legate, protected by Roman legions, its taxes flowing to the Roman treasury. Antiochus the Great was given a comfortable pension and allowed to live quietly, a king without a kingdom, the last of his line. Some accounts say that Antiochus the Great refused to accept this fate, that he tried to raise an army to reclaim his throne. If so, he failed. Other accounts claim he was murdered in 63 BCE by an Arab chieftain. The exact circumstances of his death are unclear, lost in the confusion of those transitional years. What matters is that with his death, or his retirement into obscurity, the Seleucid dynasty ended not with a battle or a dramatic last stand, but with a whimper, a footnote in the records of Roman conquest. The great cities of the Seleucid Empire passed to new rulers. Antioch became the capital of the Roman province of Syria, a great metropolis that would remain important for centuries to come. Under Roman rule, it would reach new heights of prosperity and population, becoming one of the greatest cities of the Roman Empire. But it would be a Roman city now, not a Seleucid one. Seleucia on the Tigris, that great foundation of Seleucus the Great, found itself on the border between Rome and Parthia. It would change hands multiple times in the wars between the two empires before eventually declining and being abandoned. Babylon, ancient beyond measure, slowly faded away, its population drifting to other cities, its temples falling silent, its ziggurat crumbling into dust. The eastern territories that had once acknowledged Seleucid authority had long since passed to other powers. The Parthian Empire now ruled from Mesopotamia to the borders of India, a new Persian empire in all but name. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Central Asia had themselves been conquered by nomadic peoples from the north. The Indo-Greek kingdoms that had emerged in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan would persist for a few more decades, the last remnants of Alexander's eastern conquests, before they too disappeared. Yet the end of the Seleucid Empire did not mean the end of its legacy. The cities that Seleucus and his successors had founded continued to thrive for centuries. Greek remained the language of culture and commerce throughout the Near East. The administrative systems the Seleucids had developed, blending Persian and Greek practices, were adopted by their successors. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that had occurred under Seleucid rule permanently changed the character of the region. The Seleucids had taken Alexander's conquests, which might have remained merely a brief episode of military conquest, and transformed them into lasting cultural change. They had built cities that would outlast them by centuries. They had created trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to India and Central Asia. They had fostered an environment where Greek philosophy and science could interact with Persian and Babylonian learning, creating new syntheses of knowledge. In the arts, Seleucid patronage had helped spread Greek artistic styles eastward, while also absorbing Eastern influences. Hellenistic sculpture, with its dramatic poses and realistic detail, appeared in temples from Syria to Bactria. But these sculptures often depicted Eastern deities, sometimes in combinations of Greek and Eastern iconographic styles. The result was a rich artistic tradition that belonged fully neither to Greece nor to the East, but was something new and hybrid. In religion, the Seleucid period saw fascinating developments. While the kings promoted Greek gods and built temples to Zeus and Apollo, they also honored Eastern deities. In Babylon, Seleucid kings supported the Temple of Marduk and participated in traditional Mesopotamian religious festivals. In Persia, they acknowledged the importance of Zoroastrian fire temples. Jews in Judea, despite periodic conflicts with Seleucid authorities, lived under a system that generally allowed religious freedom and self-governance. This religious tolerance, this acceptance of cultural diversity within a politically unified empire, was one of the Seleucids' most important legacies. They demonstrated that an empire need not impose cultural uniformity to maintain political control. Greek and non-Greek, Macedonian and Persian, could coexist under one banner. This model would be adopted by later empires, including Rome itself. The Seleucid period also saw important developments in science and scholarship. The library at Antioch, though never as famous as the one at Alexandria, became a significant center of learning. Greek astronomers working in Mesopotamia absorbed Babylonian astronomical knowledge, which was the most advanced in the world, and combined it with Greek mathematical techniques. The result was major advances in the understanding of planetary motion and eclipse prediction. Seleucid coinage, spread throughout the empire, became a standard medium of exchange that facilitated trade across vast distances. The Attic weight standard, used by the Seleucids, was adopted by many successor states and continued in use long after the empire fell. The very concept of Hellenistic kingship, with its combination of Macedonian military leadership, Greek cultural pretensions, and Eastern monarchical traditions, influenced how rulers throughout the region understood and exercised power. As you drift in the quiet spaces of near sleep, consider what the Seleucid Empire represented. It was not simply a conquest empire like Assyria or the short-lived realm of Alexander. It was an attempt to create something more lasting, a fusion of Greek and Eastern civilizations that would produce something new and viable. For nearly 3 centuries it succeeded. The empire held together territories that had little in common except their Seleucid rulers. It maintained relative peace and prosperity over vast regions. It allowed trade and ideas to flow freely across cultural boundaries. The Seleucids failed in the end, as all empires eventually fail. They could not solve the problem of succession, could not prevent the centrifugal forces that pulled their diverse territories apart, could not match the rising power of Rome. But in their failure, they still achieved something remarkable. They transformed the Near East in ways that would outlast them. They demonstrated that Greek and Eastern cultures could not just coexist, but could genuinely merge, creating new forms of art, architecture, administration, and thought. When the Romans took over Syria, they inherited a region that had been thoroughly transformed by 3 centuries of Seleucid rule. The cities, the roads, the administrative structures, the cultural institutions, all bore the Seleucid stamp. Rome would build on these foundations, but the foundations themselves were Seleucid. In this sense, the Seleucid Empire never truly ended. It was absorbed into something larger, its legacy preserved even as its political independence disappeared. The last king is gone, the dynasty ended, the empire transformed into a Roman province. But the cities still stand, the trade routes still hum with activity, the fusion of cultures continues to evolve. The most immediate inheritors of the Seleucid legacy were the Romans who conquered Syria and the Parthians who took the eastern provinces. Rome, that practical and acquisitive power, absorbed what it found useful in Seleucid administration. The Roman province of Syria was organized along lines that owed much to Seleucid precedent. The cities continued to function much as they had under the last kings, with their councils and magistrates. Their Greek culture and institutions, Antioch flourished under Roman rule, becoming one of the 3 or 4 greatest cities of the Roman Empire. It was here that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians, here that one of the earliest centers of Christian theology developed. But the city that nurtured early Christianity was still fundamentally the city that Seleucus had founded and his successors had developed. With its grid-patterned streets and its Hellenistic architecture, its mixture of Greek and Eastern populations, its position as a crossroads of cultures, the Parthian Empire, though hostile to the Seleucids and their conquerors Rome, nonetheless preserved elements of Seleucid governance and culture. The Parthian kings adopted the title King of Kings, echoing both Persian and Seleucid imperial pretensions. They minted coins that showed clear Hellenistic influence in their design and inscriptions. They maintained the satrap system of provincial administration that had been refined under the Seleucids. In the Parthian cities, Greek remained an important language of culture and commerce alongside Iranian languages. Even the Sasanian Persian Empire, which arose in the 3rd century CE and deliberately positioned itself as the restoration of the ancient Persian Empire. could not entirely escape the Hellenistic legacy. 3.5 centuries of Greek rule in the Near East, first under Alexander and then under the Seleucids, had left permanent marks. Greek artistic motifs appeared in Sasanian art. Greek scientific and philosophical texts, preserved and translated during the Hellenistic period, influenced Sasanian intellectual life. The very concept of empire, of a multi-ethnic realm united under a single monarch, bore traces of Seleucid as well as Persian precedent. In the realm of ideas, the Seleucid period was crucial for the transmission of knowledge between civilizations. During the 3 centuries of Seleucid rule, Babylonian astronomy and mathematics became known to Greek scholars who integrated this knowledge into their own scientific traditions. The result was a synthesis that would eventually pass through the Romans and later the Arabs to medieval Europe. Without the cultural mixing that occurred under Seleucid rule, this transmission might never have happened, or might have happened much later. Similarly, Greek philosophical and scientific texts were translated into Eastern languages during this period. Zoroastrian priests and Jewish scholars encountered Greek philosophy and integrated elements of it into their own traditions. The Judaism that emerged from the Seleucid period was different from what had come before, marked by its encounter with Hellenism, even among those Jews who most strongly resisted Hellenization. The Hebrew Bible itself, translated into Greek in the Septuagint during the Ptolemaic and Seleucid periods, became accessible to the wider Mediterranean world, setting the stage for the spread of Jewish ideas and eventually Christianity. The Seleucid era was also important for the development of historical writing. The historians who chronicled the Seleucid period, both Greek writers and native scholars writing in their own languages, established patterns of historical narrative that influenced later historians. Though most of their works are lost, fragments preserved in later writings show sophisticated historical analysis, attention to causation and motivation, and attempts to understand the interaction between different cultures. In architecture and urban planning, the Seleucid legacy was substantial. The Greek city, with its agora, gymnasium, theatre and temples, spread throughout the Near East during this period. Later cities in the region, whether built by Romans, Parthians or other powers, often followed patterns established in the Seleucid period. The ideal of the polis, the Greek city-state with its citizen body and its democratic or oligarchic institutions, persisted even under imperial rule. Local self-government, civic pride, and public benefactions remained important features of urban life in the Near East for centuries after the Seleucids fell. The Seleucid model of kingship, that peculiar blend of Macedonian military leadership, Greek cultural claims, and Eastern monarchical grandeur, influenced subsequent rulers throughout the region. Roman emperors, though they claimed to be merely first among equals in the Roman Republic, increasingly adopted the trappings and rituals of Hellenistic monarchy. The Parthian and later Sasanian kings, though they presented themselves as heirs to the ancient Persian Empire, also incorporated Hellenistic elements into their royal ideology and ceremonial. In art, Seleucid-era styles continued to influence artistic production long after the empire fell. The Gandhara art of Buddhist India, which flourished in the first few centuries CE, showed clear Hellenistic influence in its realistic portrayal of human figures. Its use of classical drapery and architectural elements, its overall aesthetic sensibility. This influence traced back to the Greek kingdoms established in Bactria and India, which were themselves offshoots of the Seleucid Empire. Through Gandhara art, Hellenistic artistic traditions influenced Buddhist art throughout Central and East Asia, reaching as far as China and Japan. The Seleucid calendar, which began in 312 BCE with Seleucus's recapture of Babylon, continued to be used long after the empire fell. Known as the Seleucid era or Anno Graecorum, it remained in use in parts of the Near East well into the medieval period. As late as the 13th century CE, over 1500 years after the end of Seleucid rule, some communities in Syria and Mesopotamia were still dating events by the Seleucid calendar. This is a remarkable testament to the lasting impression the empire made on the regions it ruled. In economic terms, the Seleucid period established trade patterns that persisted for centuries. The Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes connecting East Asia to the Mediterranean, crystallized during the Hellenistic period. The Seleucids did not create these routes from nothing. Trade between regions had existed for millennia, but the relative peace and unity of the Seleucid Empire, combined with its successor states, made long-distance trade easier and more profitable. The commercial infrastructure developed during this period, the networks of merchants and bankers, the standardization of weights and currencies, all facilitated the massive expansion of trade that characterized the late ancient world. Let your mind wander now through the centuries that followed the fall of the Seleucids. Imagine a merchant in 2nd century Rome wearing silk from China, a fabric that traveled along routes whose foundations were laid in the Seleucid period. Picture a Christian scholar in 5th century Antioch reading Greek philosophy while sitting in a city whose layout and monuments dated back to the Seleucids. See a Persian nobleman in the 6th century ruling from a palace decorated with motifs that blended Iranian and Hellenistic traditions, a legacy of cultural mixing that began under Seleucid rule. The Seleucid Empire appears in our historical sources mainly through the eyes of its rivals and successors. The Greek historians of the Hellenistic period, writing in Alexandria or Athens, often treated the Seleucids as merely one among several successor kingdoms, important but not uniquely so. Roman historians dismiss them as decadent Eastern monarchs, weak compared to Rome's republican virtue. Later, Christian writers remembered them mainly in connection with their conflicts with the Jews, seeing them through the lens of the Maccabean revolt. Parthian and later Persian sources, when they mentioned the Seleucids at all, saw them as foreign oppressors whose rule was an unfortunate interlude in Persian history. But this is not the whole story. For the 3 centuries they ruled, the Seleucids shaped the destiny of millions of people across vast territories. They built cities that became centers of culture and commerce. They maintained peace over regions that had known mainly war. They facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas across cultural boundaries. They showed that people of different languages, religions, and traditions could live together under one government, maintaining their distinctiveness while participating in a larger political and economic system. The Seleucid experiment ultimately failed. The empire was too large, too diverse, too difficult to govern effectively given the limitations of ancient technology and administration. The center could not hold when challenged by internal dissension and external pressure. But the attempt itself was significant. The Seleucids tried to create not just an empire of conquest, but a genuine multicultural state. They tried to fuse Greek and Eastern traditions into something new, and though they failed to create a lasting political entity, they succeeded in changing the cultural landscape of the Near East in permanent ways. Rest now, and let these ancient stories fade into the background of your dreaming mind. The Seleucid Empire has passed into history, but history itself never truly passes. It remains with us, shaping us in ways we often don't recognize, connecting us to people who lived and died millennia ago. The story continues, always continues, flowing like a great river toward an ocean we cannot yet see.